Pooh, Blood and Honey, number 2, is directed by Rhys Frake Waterfield, and this is a movie that, while I wasn't necessarily excited for, I was looking forward to it, because the first movie was such a dumpster fire, such an abysmal mess of a movie, that I figured, well, this one's gotta be somewhat better, right? Like, the first movie didn't have exciting kills, the Winnie the Pooh and Piglet characters were just plastic masks on redneck-looking dudes, like, there was nothing new or exciting about them. The acting from the other actors in the movie was bad, and overall the story was lackluster. So I put it at the bottom of my list last year, and I thought, okay, they got enough money to have a better budget the second time around. The filmmakers have been hyping this thing up. They said, listen, we heard what you said. The second one is going to be better. The second one's going to be great. Now, I don't know if it's considered as great, but I had an entertaining time with it. But let's get into the synopsis of this movie, and then I'll give you my positives and negatives. The movie essentially starts off with the events of the first movie happening, but not really happening the way that we have seen before. So if you haven't seen Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, you don't need to. You can jump right into part 2, which is the better of the two movies, because they kind of explain away the details of the first movie right off the bat, where the 100 Acre Woods Massacre did happen. Teens did get killed, but not the way that movie showed, because that movie is a fictional retelling in the actual Winnie the Pooh universe. And again, the way they explained that away worked for me. So now you're able to say, okay, there was a 100 Acre Woods Massacre, we're going to move on. And since the events of that first movie were fake, you now have a newly casted Christopher Robin, who is a much better actor, and you have a better cast around that Christopher Robin character. And you can also change the look of these monsters, and it doesn't really mess you up, because you're like, okay, I know they looked that way in the first movie, but if that was a fictional retelling of the real story, then now we can sort of give them a better look with the better budget that we have. So again, the way they explained that away worked for me, and now in this movie you have Christopher Robin sort of dealing with the aftermath of being vilified in that first fictional telling of the Winnie the Pooh story, and you have the monsters that are coming out of the 100 Acre Woods into the nearby town to avenge what happened to them. And what happened to them is actually a pretty cool twist on the story. Now, I'm not going to spoil it here, but that's what your movie centers around. They want revenge for some things that happened to them, the monstrous characters, so they're coming into the town to get that revenge. And then you have Christopher Robin sort of vilified by the people, but trying to understand what happened to these monsters as well. So he's sort of doing some detective work in the background while the monsters are slashing, slicing, and dicing throughout the rest of this movie. And that's the best synopsis I can give you. If that sounds like a fun time, well, I think it's already out of theaters, but if you get a chance to see this thing on a big screen, maybe they'll bring it back to theaters once more since it's getting positive reviews. You should check it out there. Otherwise, it'll probably be streaming in the summer. I would guess Peacock. I would assume the filmmakers have a deal, but I have no idea. All I know is that this is the kind of B-rate horror movie that I would show my friends down in my movie room. That's the best thing I can say about it. So with that said, let's get into my positives and some of my negatives. My first positive for this movie is going to be something we already sort of touched on, and that's that I loved the way that they were able to explain away the events of the first film. Like, since it's such a bad start to your now Winnie the Pooh universe, which is just a crazy concept in general, but since it was such a bad start, the way they were able to say that's a fictional movie, and then they doubled down on that in this movie, where they even show one of my favorite YouTubers, C3 Films, do a YouTube review of that movie in this movie, so it further shows that no, that's the fake movie universe. This is the real universe, because we even have YouTubers talking about that movie. But again, I just thought that was a really cool meta way of sort of explaining away that first movie and saying, no, this is really the beginning of the universe. And since it was done with a better budget, I accepted that, and we can move on from that first movie altogether. The next positive I have is the additional characters that they get in this movie. So you had Winnie the Pooh and Piglet the first time around, and while those two characters do look so much better in this movie, I love the addition of Tigger and Owl. More so Owl, because I thought he was genuinely creepy throughout this movie. The way he was able to fly around, sort of dive down and grab people like an owl would, was pretty awesome. He looked more like a Spider-Man villain Vulture than an actual owl, but I still had a really fun time with this character. And so the addition of monster characters from the Winnie the Pooh universe just sort of worked for me, and I'm looking forward to them adding even more in the next installment. My next positive for this movie is going to be the bear trap that Winnie the Pooh carries. Look, I just love how they were being like in on the joke. They said, listen, we know this is Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh is a bear, so why wouldn't he carry a bear trap around him and sort of make that his signature move throughout this movie? And that really worked for me. There is a gnarly point in this movie where he uses that bear trap on a girl's head, and it is great. It is one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie. So I really enjoyed how they were able to sort of use things that the fans had asked for before, because people had said, like, wait a minute, you got Winnie the Pooh and he's not carrying around honey. You got Winnie the Pooh and he's not doing something that's a signature kill move in a slasher movie. Well, now he's got a bear trap and he is a bear, and that works for me. And finally, the last positive I have for this movie is I loved the way that they explained how these creatures became monstrous. Because as a fan of Winnie the Pooh as a kid, I was like, okay, you've got to take them from being these sweet, lovable, stuffed animals to being these monstrous beings that are going on killing sprees. You have to explain why they're going on a killing spree and how they got the way that they are. And I loved the way they explained that they were. So it was great writing in that regard. It was great execution of storyline in that regard, because in the first movie, they were like, oh yeah, these things, they got left behind by Christopher Robin, and they just got irritated, and so they ate Eeyore and then moved on from there. And it was like, well, wait a minute, how did they go from these sweet stuffed animals to monsters? You don't really explain that in the first movie. But in this movie, they do a great job explaining how these things were created, how they could have been seen as sweet and lovable when they were kids, and now how they are monstrous and just hateful toward the world. So I give the filmmakers huge props for that, give the film writer huge props for that. I thought they brought all of those elements to the forefront, and that's my final positive. We got to move on to my negatives. My first negative for this movie is going to be a different additional character they had in this movie, and that is Tigger. So while I liked the addition of Tigger and Owl, and I put that in my positives, and I really liked what they did with Owl, I did not like what they did with Tigger. See, Tigger was this character when I was a kid that I was always a huge fan of, because when he showed up, you know, he was going to goof around, he was going to have a fun time. And so I thought, okay, if you add him into this movie, you could make him not Freddy Krueger, but Freddy Krueger-like, where he's sort of making jokes while he kills people. And I feel like that's where they wanted him to get to, but instead he just had really terrible dialogue. Like, he would come in and he'd be like, ah, that's gonna get you, bitch. And it was like, oh, okay, you didn't think of like a funny joke to make? Like, he's a tiger man, and you didn't find any humor in that, or you could sort of put the humor in there. At one point he tells a girl, you better watch where you're going, and then she falls down a ladder, and I was like, it just didn't come off the way that I feel like it should have come off. Like, again, in the future, if the Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey 3 movie happens and they bring Tigger back, I'd like to see him be more humorous in his killing, because as far as his killing goes, I mean, he was just running around slashing people with his claws. That's fine, but just a little more humor out of him would have been fun. Instead, he just sort of has these one-off lines where he calls people a bitch. And I was like, okay, well, I wish they had put a little more thought into his dialogue, especially in the scene where he's going around killing people. It would have been fun if he made jokes while he did it, because if he was telling jokes, none of them worked. And my other negative for this movie is going to be the way they ended it. Something felt off in the tone and pacing of the ending versus the rest of the movie. Because something I didn't say in my positives is I thought the tone and pacing of this movie was done really well. Opens with a really good kill in a camper scene. Like, it felt like a throwback to 80s slashers. Liked the way they did that. But then throughout this movie, you had Christopher Robin going on sort of a detective trail. He was also going to therapy sessions to understand what happened to him in his past. And I thought the way they weaved this story with both the Christopher Robin stuff and then the Winnie the Pooh characters slicing and dicing their way through the story all worked really well for me. You even get down to the final act of this movie where they just go ballistic in a warehouse, and there was some good and some bad mixed into that scene. Some of it worked for me, some of it didn't. But when you get down to the final showdown of this movie where it's Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin, it just sort of ends. And I was like, well, that's a little disappointing, because the rest of the tone and pacing of this movie felt really well done. And you get to the end of this movie and it's just like, we need to end it quickly. Maybe they were running out of money, I don't know. But the way they ended this movie just felt like we didn't really have a great ending, so we just thought, hit him with an axe, be done with it, we'll see you next time. That's what it felt like. It was a little disappointing. But listen, overall, guys, I had an enjoyable time with this movie. Like I said, I would recommend this movie to people. If you like B-level horror movies, I think Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey #2 will be a good time for you. If you can't catch it in theaters, definitely try to catch this one on streaming. But those are just my opinions, because that's my review for Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey #2. Have you had a chance to see this movie? If you have, let me know in the comment section down below. Maybe this is many months later after this review's already gone up and somebody found me. If you did, let me know in the comment section down below if you watched it on streaming and you enjoyed it there. But with all that said, though, guys, if you like this video, you want to watch more, don't forget to hit the like button, because it helps the video, it helps the channel, and it helps me right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. All right, guys, we got to the end of my Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey #2 review, and I had a fun time watching this movie, had a fun time making this review, and I got to see this movie with my wife on a Thursday night, which is very rare for us to get out in the middle of the week, but we were able to make it happen, and that was really fun, so I had a good time with this. With that said, if you want to check out any of the other content on my channel, well, I've got all of my horror movie reviews right there, and I've got all of my 2024 movie reviews right there.